What's going on, y'all? KMBest here, your favorite 69th ranked Marvel Snapper, and the newest card in Marvel Snap is not really that great anywhere, but I found the one deck where he actually makes sense. Miek is 1 cost, 1 power, and he has text that means he gains power every time you discard a card. At the end of the turn you discarded the card on, he will gain the power of however many cards you discarded and then move. He will not do this every time you discard, and he will not do this after a Dracula, because Dracula happens after all the turns have already ended. Miek is a very straightforward card to evaluate. It does make the typical discard list a bit better. It does not make the typical discard list actually that good, and it is extremely replaceable if you're just going to play the typical discard list. When I say typical discard list, this is what I mean. You are playing your typical, I am going to discard some cards, and then I am going to get some scaling guys off of that, and Miek is worse than bad Morbius in this list, because Morbius is significantly better, both in terms of being an ongoing card, you can draw it later, and because Morbius will never move to a location that screws you over. Miek is fine. I think he is a reasonable upgrade in this list, but I don't think he's all that different from running something like Nebula or Iceman. And while I do think he is better in the games where you do have MODOK, he is likely to be worse in the games where you don't. So while I do consider him a minor upgrade for the discard list, I don't consider him an upgrade that is going to significantly move the needle for the archetype. So where does that leave us with Miek? I thought it left us absolutely nowhere, and then I got my butt whooped on ladder by a guy playing Miek. That guy was Jimmy Dickins, and he put Miek in a combo Wong shell that actually made him a viable threat. He beat me with a 17 power Miek, and I think this is a unique among Miek decks as a deck that actually needs Miek. It is a deck that where you have Miek in it, it is significantly better than when you don't have Miek in it. And I think every other Miek deck, he's extremely replaceable. We finally have one deck where he actually makes sense. And when I look at new cards, that's how I try to evaluate them. I'm not saying this is a good deck. I'm not saying this is a great deck. I think it's like, mildly okay. It's like mid, right? I wouldn't recommend you buy Miek to get this deck. But if you did buy Miek, I would suggest you play this deck, right? We're talking about something that is, I think, pretty marginal, but he was playing it in top 100. He beat me while I was playing Loki. It's obviously not the most unplayable garbage of all time. It is a deck, and I think that goes a long way in the early days of a card. Getting people thinking in different ways is important. This is the deck, and because I am not the subject matter expert here, I actually tracked down Jim Dickins after he put a beating on me with Miek on ladder, and we're going to go right to that interview right now so you can understand how to play this deck. I am joined by Jimmy Dickins, top 100 grinder, who was the only person playing Miek in the top 100, and he beat me twice with it. Sometimes I helped. And I wanted to highlight the only person I actually saw doing anything that was sort of resembling successful with Miek in high elo. So I tracked him down to ask him one very important question. Jim Dickins, how are you now?
Good and you.
All right. So this deck is a very solid, sneaky kind of archetype. And I think it is the kind of deck that Miek actually makes more sense in as a real needle mover compared to the typical discard archetype. Because the typical discard archetype, he's just kind of there. You don't need a second Morbius as much, but this deck really needs a second Morbius to the point that it's already playing Collector, which is definitely second bad Morbius. And so Miek is like, arguably, I would say probably a little better than Collector if it weren't for the unpredictability of where he was going, right? Like, this is an actual card that is actually upgrading the list. So first things first, let's talk about what this list is. I'm going to give you my read of it, and you can tell me if I'm wrong or not. This is a Wong deck. Before anything else, this is a deck that is doing Wong things, and it is trying to use Wong to create giant Mieks, giant Collectors, giant Morbius. And sometimes, you gambit people, but you have giant Dakin, giant Miek, giant Collector, giant Morbius. that's pretty much the game plan here. You are trying to do something stupid with a Wong. And that is like plan A of the deck. And plan B of the deck is like some mid-rangey discard stuff, but it's kind of a bad mid-range deck. So tell me if I'm wrong about specifically plan A here, because it does feel like this is a Wong deck.
Yeah, no, you're 100% correct. It's Wong first. I mean, you can eke out some wins without having getting a Wong down, but it pretty much lives or dies on Wong on four.
Yeah. And I think that that is an interesting place to be because, like, do you think this is like the best or the strongest or the most unexpected Wong deck? Do you think it's up there with the other ones? How would you rank
Uh,
it?
um, I mean, this is definitely not the strongest Wong deck, so
Mhm.
yeah, it probably comes as a surprise. But I mean, if you're seeing Morbius, if you're seeing Collector, Morbius is pretty much the big tell, and you see Wong coming down, Modoc's going on it,
Yeah.
something like that. So it's not probably shocks your opponent that you're playing something like this in the first place, but it's maybe not as telegraphed as with Wong Panther or something like that.
Right. So here's what I actually like about it is that yes, this is a combo deck that dies to like a ton of very obvious interaction, but it doesn't really seem like anyone's playing that interaction right now. Like there's just not a lot of the cards that beat you. Can you give me some of the cards that you would be terrified? Like if you see these cards, you're like, oh God, I can't do anything about that. Give me a list, and I know what number one is, but
Yeah,
say it for
well,
just
yeah,
yeah,
obviously Cosmo.
yeah,
Cosmo's the big one. You put Wong down. Enchantress hurts not only Wong, Enchantress and Rogue hurts your Wong, hurts your Morbius. But I've seen Rogue more than Enchantress.
yeah,
And usually they'll go for the Morbius, which is usually okay, but the Morbius is one of your big stat sticks. So those are the big three. Magneto can be a pain if you don't if they're smart enough to yank the Wong out of the lane if you don't have Prio. Those are, and then the big tech Shang-Chi, Shadow King, although he's not as apparent as he has
yeah.
been
He's
in the past,
gone.
which is weird. Because he's still pretty good. But yeah, those are the big tech cards, which is still a lot, but a lot of them are not generally run right now.
So one of the things that I actually was pretty impressed with this deck is that it showed a decent amount of restraint in the sense that you are not investing in something like a Mystique here. You are not a Gambit combo deck.
Hmm.
He's there and he can do things, but that's not what
Hmm.
you're doing. And the other thing that impressed me about it was the way it incorporated all of the different disparate sort of roles that the main scalers have. And by that I mean the helicarrier actually kind of good. Like I never expected it to
Yes.
be like, oh, I'm top 100. I just lost to helicarrier. Except I had to retreat because I was like, oh yeah, I'm just dead to the fact that he had a helicarrier there. I die to that, and it's like, oh, the card is not awful, and I think this is probably the best helicarrier deck I've ever seen because it makes sense. It helps the collector. It gives you more stuff to discard for Meek. Gives you more stuff to discard for Morbius. And it's like the kind of thing that gives you extra Modoc procs on that Modoc Wong that makes all of them much, much bigger. And I think that that is like the real role it has here. And I honestly am pretty impressed by the way your scalers overlap. Like Dakin, for example, it adds a point of power to collector. It's an extra card to discard. There's all this overlap in the deck that I think is an underrated part of it.
Yeah, yeah, it does overlap kind of nicely, and you have to think with Meek a little more because I
Yeah.
mean you're not. It's not like traditional discard. I mean, one of the reasons Meek just doesn't work in traditional discard, in my opinion, because you're not discarding really that much.
Yeah.
That's why this is a pure greed deck. But because you're not discarding that much, you're discarding more over time. This is looking really to pay off on turn fours and fives. So you can kind of you'll maybe shoot for the 50-50, but if you can at least get Meek to the lane that you don't want him in, and then shoot off that big payoff at the end, then you could at least guide him towards a lane you like. But the helicarrier is I like using helicarrier when I can because it's such a bad card, but it actually is really helpful in this deck.
So let's talk about the man of the hour. I mean, this video is about Meek. Yes, it's about the deck, but it's about this guy specifically. And I guess my question is, do you need Meek to play this deck to its full effectiveness?
I'd say this is the one discard deck you do need Meek. I mean, needs a strong word, I guess. He does help the deck. You can run it without him probably fine. Because you do have your three big stat sticks with Collector, Morbius, and then Dakin. You can still get pretty big without Meek, but it's really the bottom half is get some scalers out there, and then the top half is get those discard payoffs if you can. But it's pretty iffy without Meek, oddly enough.
So for the record, that is the reason I brought you on, because I think Meek in most other discard decks is like 100% replaceable. And so I wanted to be like, all right, what is like an actual deck that does need this card? What does that even look like? And so far, this is the only one that I can think of where it's like, oh wow, this card is necessary. Like I can't think of
Yeah, this is
any other decks. And like even a card like Hercules, I'm like, okay, yeah, I totally see a deck where you need that card.
yeah.
I get it. With Meek, it's like, it's pretty much this and that's it. And because the reason for that is this deck is so invested in like the Wong Modoc scaling that Meek is
Mhm.
like, what would you say he is on average in this deck?
So average. I mean, if you get the Wong combo with Modoc, he gets pretty big. I mean, he can get up to like Wong Modoc and maybe have a helicarrier in hand. He can get up to like 12, 13, 14, pretty consistently.
Yeah,
Uh, yeah,
I believe in our game he was 17. And it was just like, oh,
yeah.
Jesus, that guy is huge. Moving on, I wanted to ask about Apocalypse, which strikes me as odd. Like I feel
Hmm.
like when I look at it, the reason it's in here is because you wanted to be able to play a card that would get discarded and get added back to your hand, but you're never actually playing this guy. There's no Dracula, there's no Lady Sif. He's just there to be, and this is going to sound weird, bad helicarrier?
Wow, never heard of that. That's a brand new term
Yeah.
coined right here. Um, yes and no. I mean, ideally you can get Wong, Modoc, and then you have a bunch of swarms and Apocalypse, so you can play him. But I'd say like 80% of the time, yeah, he's just stuck in your hand. You're probably going to be playing something on the last turn, or you're playing the Modoc on the last turn. So yeah, he kind of is bad helicarrier. He's he, you'd be surprised how useless he actually is because you usually need to spread at the end of the game. But every so often, it's nice to have, 12, 16, 20 power APOC. Then, I believe, in fact, the second game against you, I think that's what you had to worry about was a big APOC coming down somewhere at least. I might be mistaken, but yeah, he can still be a threat, and that sometimes is enough.
Yeah, I mean, like, yeah, sometimes I guess you are just like an APOC swarm deck, right? Like you just have a big
Hmm.
APOC and you have some swarms and it's like fine, right? Like it's just
Right. Yeah, it's
it's
fine.
like you have all this other stuff and it's just like, all right, fine. We have our terrible end game, but it's fine because we have like a Morbius and a collector that are each like 15 power or whatever, like Meek Morbius that are both enormous. And that's like fine. You just put a bunch of stats on the board and your combo deck went off and normally you can beat most stuff with it.
Mhm. Yeah. No, no, definitely. It's kind of yeah, it's kind of silly to have APOC there without really wanting or needing the what APOC's supposed to be there for, which is a big stats that you get through Dracula at the end. Kind of in the old Shadows days.
So Hell Cow is not in this deck, and in most discard decks, I think she's pretty mediocre. But in this one specifically, it's like I wouldn't hate being able to have a backup Modoc some of the time, right? So why are we not playing Hell Cow, and what could change to make you want to do it?
So so this has gone through a couple iterations. It didn't have Helicarrier originally, that's for sure. And it didn't have, it had Mystique, but I found Mystique super awkward. Like I wasn't finding a good place to have her. Um, and Hellcow, it was kind of the same way. Because turn four, you want to get that Wong down, and if you don't have that Wong down, you likely don't want to play your Hellcow yet. So and because of his inconsistency, it just the 4/8's nice. The discard two cards is nice if you can get him onto Wong. then the 4 card discard is nice, but it just wasn't. It was oddly less consistent than just having the cards that are in there now, even with Gambit, because at least with Gambit, you can destroy some cards, as opposed to just discarding your hand and hoping for the best. Um, so it, yeah, it's just it through playtesting, it just wasn't working out for me. I'd say you can probably realistically drop maybe Gambit for Hell Cow, if you wanted to do it that way. Although I do like the Gambit, even though this is when it comes to Thanos Blob, it's like half the time they're snapping on
Yeah.
turn 1, 2, 3, and I'm
Yeah,
leaving
yeah, yeah.
anyway.
Yeah.
So, but other than that, I do like him because he can be a surprise in and of himself.
All right. So I think that wraps up all of my questions. But if you had to give any advice to someone who, ill-advisedly just purchased Meek, stumbled on this video, and is like, okay, well, this is the only deck that Meek actually seems kind of plausible in, what advice would you give them, especially regarding snaps?
Yeah, the snap conditions are interesting. If you get Wong in hand, you can almost certainly that's you're going to have one of the better lines in the deck, because you're likely going to be drawing. You can either get it with a dock and you can get it with Colleen Wing and all of that. And that's one of the reasons I do like this deck ultimately is because Wong is the central figure, not necessarily Modoc all the time. But I'd say if you get 2 of your scalers in hand and a Wong by turn 3, then that's a pretty good time to snap. Because again, this you can play Modoc on 6 and usually be pretty happy with it, no matter what your opponent does. Now again, the tier 0 deck is always tough to go up against, so I don't know about that case. But with most other decks, that at least that I've been seeing, once you get at least 2 scalers in hand and Wong, you're pretty happy to snap, at least at that point. So that would be my advice. But I would definitely say practice with it a little bit because it's going to feel a little awkward at first because turn 2 is play Collector, play Morbius. You got a lot of 2s that you can work with, but turns 3 and 4 can feel awkward if you don't have that Wong. Because it's like, well, do I dock it now? I'm only doing a 3/8 as opposed to the 3/16 if I wait for Wong or risk it on the Wong. Kind of analyze what deck your opponent's playing if you can, and if you really need that one big stat stick in one lane, then Gamba on it. But that's ultimately kind of is what this deck is. It's a little Gamba, but it has a big enough payoff where you can go up against some pretty heavy hitters.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Jim Dickins,
Yeah,
where can people find more from you? I know you're a writer at Snap Fan, I believe.
Yes, that is true. I do write for Snap.fan, so that would be the one place.
All right.
Otherwise, but yeah, otherwise it's you'll see me in various random discords too. So
It's true. Thank you so much for joining us and have
my
a
pleasure.
good one. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for making it through that. I know the audio quality wasn't the best. It was very impromptu. You got to understand, when I lose to someone on ladder and track them down and they're willing to do a deck tech the same day, I take what I can get. Hopefully, that gave you a bit more insight into what actually you can do to make Meek good, as opposed to just playing him in the typical, oh, I'm putting him in discard. Oh, okay, it's like 2% better than playing Iceman. Like, that's not an exciting thing to do with him. This is an exciting thing to do with him, and I really hope you enjoy playing this deck. However, I will be 100% clear, this deck is probably not going on my tier list. It is fine, but it is not a compelling reason to buy Meek. And I want to be super clear that when I do a review like this, you do not go out and buy Meek and then be like, KM told me to buy Meek. I did not tell you to buy Meek. I would advise you don't buy Meek. I think it's probably a bad use of your tokens and a bad use of your caches. But I know there's a bunch of people out there who were like, I would like a Nihilus. I would like Phoenix Force. What do I do with this guy? This is what you do with him. Thanks for watching, y'all. I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. Remember to like and subscribe. I will see you in the next one. The decks that make the game, there's some balance that is necessary. Miss Marvel gave them hope that I was playing the other lanes. That's why I did it. That was like the whole point of my Miss Marvel middle thing. with the vision and everything like that. That was the whole point, was trying to bait them in there. But boy, I didn't expect it to work quite that well. I was just like, all right, they'll figure it out, right? They just did not. Meek! Ha! Well, I'm never discarding a card. So for one of us, that's not a problem. Oh, that's disgusting. Yo, Captain Poop! Thank you. Welcome back to the besties, Captain Poop. I'm horrified here. Like, I want to do the Legion scam, but I don't think they're going to play on Space Throne. Okay, that helps a lot. Never seen before, even though you literally just played it. Yeah, I don't get that one. Was this Gambit or something? Oh my god. I just killed myself. What the fuck? I just actually killed myself. You cannot be serious. If it doesn't hit that, we win. Stop wishing bad juju on me. And then being happy when it happens. Yeah, I'll cry. Don't fucking talk to me, dude. I will cry. Holy shit. Oh, it's the that guy. I remember. I remember what this is. This is the game Gladiator betrayed me in. All right, Gladiator, try not to do it again. All right, Gladiator, just don't betray me again. Fair enough. probably not winnable, but we're going to find out. Do you feel the SD team tuned back the early scalers to facilitate the Planet Hulk season meta? No, I don't. People are reading way too fucking far into that Glenn comment. I think people are being extremely stupid about it, basically. That is my take. Legion left would have been fun. It would have been a play. They have a billion swarms in hand. This seems unwinnable. Hand is just all swarms and random generators. Yeah, helicarrier 6 drops and free swarms.